I knew the HOA president was going to be a problem the second she showed up at my door with a clipboard and a fake smile. "Hi there, I'm Winona Griggs, president of the Meadow Glen Lakes Homeowners Association," she chirped, as if her name carried some kind of authority I should care about. I had moved into the neighborhood 3 weeks ago. My name's Darren Orley, and after 2 decades as a municipal engineer and a divorce that cost me more than my sanity, I was finally living in a home I actually liked. Brick, solid foundation, big backyard. I picked it because it backed up to a green belt, and I could finally start my retirement side project, restoring vintage motorcycles. Winona didn't even wait for me to invite her in. She stepped onto my porch and motioned toward my garage. "We have rules about visible machinery," she said, eyeing the bike frame I had on a lift. "And noise. And yard aesthetics. And I'll need you to fill out these compliance forms within 48 hours. I gave her a long look. "You realize I'm inside the garage, right? Doors are closed when I work. And that's my private property." She sniffed. "Everything in Meadow Glen Lakes falls under the HOA's jurisdiction. Read the bylaws." Then she smiled. "Not the kind you return. The kind that tells you this woman has never been told no in her entire life." That was my welcome to the neighborhood. It got worse fast. 2 weeks later, I noticed a weird odor in my backyard. Thought maybe a raccoon had died near the fence line. But after a day, the smell was unbearable. I stepped out to find a sludgy pool of brown water oozing into my lawn. Sewage. Raw, disgusting, bubbling sewage. I followed the flow back up the slight slope of the hill and saw it leaking from under the fence that separated my yard from Winona's. I knocked on her door. She opened it with the same fake smile. "Oh, Darren, how pleasant. Winona, your sewer line is leaking into my yard. It's a public health hazard." Her smile didn't even twitch. "I'll have someone look at it," she said, and then closed the door in my face. No apology. No urgency. 3 days passed. It got worse. My grass turned to sludge, the smell got more intense, and I couldn't even mow the front yard without gagging. I called the city. They sent a guy out. He confirmed it. Yep. Sewer lines cracked on her property. "It's draining downhill into yours," he said, tapping his tablet. "She's got 48 hours to fix it before we fine her." I thought that'd be the end of it. It wasn't. The next morning, I woke up to a notice taped to my door. "Violation notice. Unauthorized landscaping modifications. You are hereby fined $350. I stormed over to the HOA office, which was conveniently operated out of Winona's converted garage. Winona sat behind a desk like she was running a military base. "You're fining me for my backyard?" I snapped. "The one flooded with your sewage?" She didn't even flinch. "Your yard is now in violation due to standing water and unsanitary conditions. You have 72 hours to remedy it or face additional fines. You're the one who caused this. I suggest you speak to a plumber, Darren," she said sweetly. "You're responsible for your own property." That's when I realized something. She was trying to bury me in fines. She didn't want me fixing it. She wanted me gone. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just nodded, turned, and walked out. But I had a plan. I started by pulling the property records. Her house was built in the 70s. Original plumbing, which meant clay sewer pipes. Fragile, brittle, and known for hairline cracks. I had my buddy, who works in hydro excavation, come by to take a look with a scope camera. We didn't even need to dig. The main line from her house to the sewer access was leaking in 3 places badly. And guess what? One of those leaks was right along our property line. The city had a clause in the municipal code: if someone's utility line crosses into your property and causes damage, and they don't fix it within 5 days of written notice, you're legally allowed to mitigate the damage yourself. So I did. I waited until she was out, probably at the HOA's mandatory community brunch. Then I rented a cement mixer. I dug a small trench on my side of the fence, right where the pipe crossed into my yard. Used the scope to find the breach. Then I poured fast-set concrete straight into the leaking section. Not just a little. A full bag of Quikrete. It hardened in less than an hour. The next day, she came storming across the lawn, heels sinking into the now dried sludge. "You tampered with my sewer line." "No," I said calmly, holding up a copy of the municipal code. "I mitigated a hazard on my property. Your pipe was causing damage. I fixed it." "You poured cement into my line." "No, I poured cement into a hole in my yard. If someone's pipe happened to be there, well, maybe they should have handled it when they were warned." She sputtered. "This is criminal." "Feel free to call the cops," I said. "Or better yet, call a plumber. You're going to need one."
And boy, did she.
By that afternoon, she had a crew jackhammering her driveway to access the line. They had to tear out a 15-foot section of her front yard. And the best part? She couldn't find me for yard conditions anymore, because now her yard looked like a war zone. But it didn't stop there. A week later, I got a visit from a guy named Curtis. Gray beard, Vietnam vet, lived 2 houses down. He leaned on his cane and said, "Son, I saw what you did. That woman's been running this place like a dictator for 10 years. About time someone punched back." Turns out, I wasn't the only one she tried to push out. Curtis handed me a stack of old violation notices, some going back years.
Fake finesse.
Fabricated complaints. Even one where she tried to evict a single mom over a toy left in the front yard. I scanned every one of them, and I started building a file. Because Winona's sewage wasn't the only thing leaking. Something else was about to burst wide open. 2 days after Winona's front yard turned into a construction site, I found a letter in my mailbox.
No envelope.
Just a page torn from a legal pad, folded once, with my name written in shaky cursive across the front. Inside was a single sentence: "You're not the only one with a file." I stood there for a moment, letting the wind rustle the paper in my hand. Then I looked up toward her house. The shades were drawn, and half her lawn had been scraped into piles of dead sod. A single orange cone marked the open sewer access where her plumber had given up the day before. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was rattled. That meant it was working. I scanned the letter for fingerprints, not because I thought it would lead to anything, just to be thorough. Years of engineering had made me methodical. I logged the note in my growing binder of HOA-related incidents, then set up 2 motion-activated trail cameras in the hedges flanking my mailbox. Discreet ones. Infrared.
No clicks, no lights.
If she or someone she sent came creeping around again, I'd know. That night, I went to Curtis's place. He lived in a corner lot at the end of the cul-de-sac, where the porch light never stopped buzzing and the paint peeled off the shutters like sunburnt skin. He had been collecting HOA nonsense for years. What he showed me next made my stomach turn. A spreadsheet. Printed on matrix paper. Each row was a neighbor. Each column was a fine or complaint, handwritten in red pen beside a dollar amount. "You kept this?" I asked, flipping through the pages. "Started when she tried to charge me for having a flagpole," Curtis said. Said it was a non-standard vertical installation. I figured if she was going to make up rules, I'd make a record. I traced down the list. A woman named Marlene charged twice for the same missing mailbox number. A guy named Theo fined for inconsistent mulch density. One of the entries had a star next to it, $500 for improper seasonal decor.
Curtis pointed to that one.
She gave that to a woman who put up a paper turkey in her window after Thanksgiving. A pattern was emerging. The fines weren't random. They were targeted. Anyone who pushed back, questioned a rule, or even parked too close to Winona's lawn ended up on her radar. And once you were on her radar, the violations multiplied. I leaned back in the folding chair on Curtis's porch and looked out at the quiet row of houses beyond. "She's not just power tripping," I said. She's running a racket. Curtis nodded. And most folks just pay and hope she leaves them alone. But she never does. The next morning, I paid a visit to the county recorder's office. I requested public records for every lien filed by Meadow Glen Lakes HOA in the last 10 years. The clerk, a woman named Tilda with a coffee mug that said, "I know where the bodies are buried," raised an eyebrow when she saw the volume. "You sure you want all of these?" "I'll take whatever you've got, digital or paper." She led me to a back room where file cabinets lined the walls. I spent the next 4 hours digging through folders. What I found confirmed my suspicions. There were over 24 liens filed against homeowners. Most were under $5,000. All were signed by Winona Griggs. A few had been paid. Several had ended in forced sales, people who'd lost their homes over trumped-up violations. But one file stood out. A man named Ernest Holbrook. Liens totaling over $17,000. Fines for everything from vegetation obstruction, his rose bush apparently grew too close to the sidewalk, to unauthorized pet presents, he owned a cat. The last document in the file was a notice of foreclosure. That one hit me harder than the others. I remembered the name. Ernest had died 2 years ago.
Stroke.
I'd seen it mentioned in a forum when I first looked up the neighborhood. I drove to the address. The house was still empty. For sale sign out front. Grass overgrown. Mail overflowing the box. I looked up the deed online. The HOA now owned it. Not a bank. Not a private buyer. The HOA. Winona. She had fined a man into foreclosure, then transferred the title to the association she controlled. This wasn't a nuisance anymore. It was criminal. I called a friend of mine, Reina Martinez. She and I had worked together back in the city planning department. She was now an investigator in the district attorney's office, white-collar crimes division. I met her for lunch at a sandwich shop near the courthouse and laid out what I had. She listened without interruption, flipping through the copies I'd made of the liens, fines, and deed transfers. "She's weaponizing the HOA," I said, tapping the file. "And she's using it to take people's homes." Reina nodded slowly. "You said she filed these personally?" "Every one of them. Signed, notarized, and filed through her own office." Reina's eyes narrowed. "That's unauthorized conveyance if she didn't follow proper legal process. And if she profited personally. That's fraud. Maybe racketeering." I handed her the spreadsheet Curtis had given me. "This is just the start." She closed the file. "I'll open a preliminary inquiry. Quiet for now. If you can get me proof she's collecting fines through personal accounts or misappropriating funds, we'll move it up the chain." That night, I walked the neighborhood with Curtis. We knocked on doors. Spoke to anyone willing to answer. Some were skeptical. Others were scared. But a few, like Theo and the woman with the paper turkey, were ready to talk. I recorded every conversation. Got written statements when I could. Dates, amounts, threats. One man said Winona told him if he didn't pay a landscaping fine, she'd have his car towed.
It was parked in his own driveway.
The next morning, I checked the trail cam footage. Got her. Winona, wearing a hoodie and gloves, slipping a second note into my mailbox at 2:37 in the morning. That was a federal offense by itself. I called Reina. She picked up on the first ring. "Got her on camera tampering with mail," I said. "And I've got neighbors ready to testify." She was quiet for a beat. "Give me 48 hours. I spent the next day installing a second camera, this one angled at her front door from across the street, hidden in a birdhouse I rigged to a utility pole. If she tried anything else, I'd catch it. 48 hours later, Reina called.
"We're going in," she said.
Search warrant signed. She's under investigation for fraud, elder abuse, and illegal property seizure. Stay clear of her house tonight. We don't want her tipped off. I didn't sleep. At 7 the next morning, I stepped onto my porch with a cup of coffee and watched two unmarked cars pull up in front of Winona's house. 4 investigators stepped out.
One of them wore a badge on a chain.
They knocked, waited, then went in. An hour later, they emerged with boxes, computers, ledgers, a safe. Winona came out in handcuffs. Word spread fast. By noon, half the neighborhood was outside. Conversations buzzed across driveways and lawns. People who hadn't spoken in years were suddenly swapping stories, comparing notes, sharing what they'd been through. Curtis stood beside me, arms crossed. Never thought I'd see the day. She underestimated this neighborhood, I said. She thought she could scare everyone into silence. Curtis gave a rare smile. She forgot what happens when people stop being afraid. The HOA office, her converted garage, was sealed off with police tape. The city assigned a temporary administrator to oversee things until a new board could be elected. One of the first things they did was wipe every bogus fine from the record. As for me, I patched up my yard, replanted the grass, and finally finished restoring that vintage motorcycle. And people waved when they passed my house now. Not because I fixed a sewer line or exposed a fraud, but because I reminded them what it looked like when someone stood up and said, "Enough." And this time, enough was exactly the right amount. 3 weeks after the warrant was executed, I found myself sitting in the back row of a town hall meeting, flanked by Curtis and Theo, listening to the interim HOA administrator rattle off a list of emergency bylaws being suspended. The room was packed to the walls, standing room only. People who had avoided these meetings for years were now front and center, waiting to see what came next. No one said Winona's name out loud, but her shadow loomed over everything. The air was tense, not with fear this time, but with long overdue anticipation. The community wasn't just watching anymore, they were paying attention. I kept quiet, just listening, taking mental notes. Raina had warned me that the legal process would drag out. But what she hadn't said, and what I learned soon enough, was that the worst of it hadn't even come to light yet. The day after the town hall, I got a call from Raina. She asked me to come down to her office, said she had something I needed to see in person. I took the long route through downtown, past the courthouse, past the now closed office building where Winona had once rented a conference room to hold mandatory compliance seminars. Raina met me in the lobby. She didn't say anything until we got upstairs and into her office, where she closed the door and pulled a thick folder from her desk drawer. She slid it in front of me without a word. I opened it. Bank statements.
Wire transfers.
One to a landscaping company in Phoenix. Another to a compliance consultancy in Tampa. All from the HOA account. All signed off by Winona. She was funneling association funds into shell companies, Raina said, pacing slowly behind me. And we confirmed those companies were registered under different names, but same street address in Scottsdale. Her nephew owns the building. I flipped through the statements. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands in consulting fees, legal retainers, and infrastructure audits. All phony. All laundered. She was laundering HOA dues? I asked. Raina nodded. And not just dues. She was collecting special assessments that never made it into the official books. The paper trail goes back nearly 8 years. I leaned back in the chair, trying to process it. That's not just fraud. That's grand larceny. Raina's expression turned grim. It gets worse. The city issued reimbursement grants 6 years ago for stormwater management upgrades after a flood. Meadow Glen Lakes received one. $40,000. Supposed to go toward trenching and runoff diversion. None of it was ever done. I remembered the way rainwater used to pool near the culverts on the east side of the neighborhood. People always blamed bad drainage. Turns out, the work had never been scheduled in the first place. She pocketed the grant money. Every cent, Raina said. And she forged the inspection reports to make it look like the work was complete. I closed the folder. How long until she's formally charged? She's being indicted tomorrow morning. We're preparing 6 felony counts: fraud, embezzlement, falsification of public documents, misuse of municipal grants, criminal conspiracy, and elder financial abuse. I stood slowly. Will the community find out? They're going to know everything. We're making the indictment public. The next morning, the headlines hit. Former HOA president indicted in multi-year fraud scheme. That was the top story in the county paper. The photo they used wasn't flattering. Winona being led out of her house in cuffs, her expression pinched and furious, trying to turn her face from the camera. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Not until I saw the damage up close. Curtis and I spent the next few days walking the neighborhood again, this time with a clipboard. We documented every broken sidewalk, every incomplete drainage area, every project listed in the HOA budget that had never materialized. One woman, Marlene, who lived 2 streets over, showed us a folder of HOA invoices she'd kept. Almost everyone had a different payment address. One went to an office in Kansas, another to a P.O. box in Reno, all redirected through companies that didn't exist. She said they were third-party processors. Marlene told us, her voice shaking. I didn't question it. She always made it sound like if you didn't pay, your house would be flagged. She was banking on fear, Curtis said, scribbling notes. That same afternoon, Raina called again. We interviewed her nephew, she said. He flipped. Said she promised him a cut of the consulting fees if he let her register fake companies under his name. But he never actually received any money. She used his identity and left him exposed. I whistled. She burned her own family. She burned everyone. By the end of the week, the HOA's financials were frozen. The city appointed a forensic accountant to sort through the mess. Community meetings turned into full-on town audits. Neighbors who'd never spoken before were now cross-referencing statements, organizing documents, comparing notes. And that's when we found the final nail. Theo had been going through old HOA meeting recordings stored online in a barely functioning archive and stumbled on one from 5 years back. The video showed Winona presenting a reserve fund allocation plan. What caught our attention wasn't the presentation, it was the signature on the document she held up. It wasn't hers. It was forged. The treasurer at the time, a soft-spoken retired teacher named Joyce, had passed away a year later. But her signature had been used on multiple forms long after her death. We pulled the originals and compared them. The handwriting didn't match. Not even close. She was signing off on reallocation of funds under a dead woman's name, I said. She forged a dead board member's signature. Theo added, his voice tight. That's not just unethical. That's criminal forgery. We handed the evidence over to Raina, who added it to the growing case file. With the forged documents, the charges doubled. The DA announced a revised indictment, 12 counts in total. At the next town hall, the atmosphere had completely shifted. This wasn't just a community airing grievances anymore. It was a neighborhood rebuilding itself from the ground up. The interim administrator stepped down. Elections were held. Curtis was nominated and elected chair of the new board. Theo took over finance. Marlene volunteered for communications. I refused a formal position, but agreed to stay on as an advisor for infrastructure and compliance. Our first order of business: full transparency. We digitized the records. Every fine, every payment, every meeting agenda made public, searchable, archived. We brought in a contractor to finish the stormwater work Winona had faked. And for the first time, people actually showed up to vote on how their money was being used. The new board also passed a resolution to refund every single improper fine collected under Winona's rule. It would take time, but we had the documentation. And we had the will. One evening, as I sat on my porch cleaning the last of the tools from the cement job, a car pulled up to the curb. A woman stepped out, mid-30s, sharp suit, no-nonsense energy. She introduced herself as ADA Lisa Grange, part of Raina's extended team. She handed me a sealed envelope. Testimony request, she said. You're on the witness list. I looked at the envelope, then back at her. For the trial? She nodded. You're the first domino. They want the jury to understand how it started. I accepted the envelope. I just fixed a pipe. You exposed a criminal enterprise. She turned and got back into her car. A week later, I sat in the witness box in front of a jury of 12 strangers and told the story of how my backyard flooded with sewage. I told them about the cement, the notes, the neighbors, the files. I told them about the fear that had kept people silent and the facts that finally set them free. And when it was over, I walked back to my seat and met Curtis's eyes in the gallery. He nodded once. We hadn't just taken down a crooked HOA president. We'd taken back our neighborhood. The courtroom was packed on the final day. Not in a loud or chaotic way, but in the kind of still, humming silence you get when people are collectively holding their breath. I sat 2 rows behind the prosecution's table, just close enough to see the jury's faces. Most of them were stone-faced, but a few glanced toward the defense table with unmistakable disbelief. Winona sat between her 2 attorneys, her posture rigid like she was still chairing a meeting. But her eyes gave her away. They didn't scan the gallery for supporters. They didn't glare at the judge. They flicked downward, again and again, toward the stack of exhibits the prosecution had submitted. By then, the evidence had gone far beyond the forged signatures and fake consulting fees. The forensic audit had uncovered 2 off-the-books properties purchased through a front company using HOA funds both in her sister's name. One of them had a tenant who testified that their rent payments were made out to a P.O. box in a neighboring county. That trail had led directly to a safe deposit box containing over $60,000 in cash. Her defense tried to claim it was a personal inheritance. The ADA didn't even dignify it with a counterargument. She simply played the recording of Winona explaining to her nephew how to scrub the paper trail and backdate the dummy invoices. The jury didn't need convincing after that. When the judge read the verdict, no one clapped. No outbursts. Just a collective exhale. Guilty on all 12 counts. Sentencing was delayed 2 weeks for a pre-sentencing report, but from what Raina told me, the judge was leaning toward the higher end of the guidelines. Maximum term for financial crimes of that scale, added time for the abuse of her position as an HOA officer, and an additional bump for exploiting elderly residents in the process. Afterward, I stepped out into the sunlight and took a long walk through the neighborhood. It felt different now. Not just cleaner, or friendlier, though both were true, but less clenched. As if the place itself had been holding tension under its skin for years and was finally letting it go. At the corner house, I passed a group of kids drawing chalk dragons on the sidewalk. A man was repainting his shutters 2 shades brighter than the old beige uniformity Winona had enforced. Across from him, someone had started a community garden in the old retention zone she once fined people for stepping into. I turned the corner and saw Theo standing on a ladder, fixing the light on one of the old HOA bulletin boards. "You ever think you'd see the day?" I asked. He chuckled and came down a rung. I didn't think I'd live long enough to see an HOA president get perp-walked for racketeering, so no. I pointed to the bulletin. "What are we posting? New board minutes." Actual ones. And a sign-up sheet for the block party. First one in 15 years. Block party?
Yeah.
Curtis insisted. Said if we're going to run this place right, we better start with something that includes a grill and no speeches. I nodded. That man's got priorities. Theo climbed down, wiped his hands on a rag, and handed me a strip of duct tape. "You did good, you know. Not a lot of people would have stood their ground like you did." "I didn't plan to make it a crusade," I said. "I just wanted my backyard to stop smelling like a septic tank."
He laughed.
"And now she's going to prison for laundering HOA dues through a bogus landscaping company called Evergreen Horizons." I raised a brow. Still the worst fake business name I've ever heard. Agreed. Later that week, I found myself in a meeting room at City Hall. A few of us from the neighborhood had been invited to a public advisory session. Someone had floated the idea of creating a municipal oversight committee for HOAs. Apparently, Meadow Glen Lakes wasn't the only community dealing with abuse of power, just the only one where someone had cracked it open. The city attorney took notes as Curtis explained how Winona had manipulated the bylaws to funnel money without triggering audits. Theo walked them through the fake vendor invoices. Marlene had brought copies of the old complaint letters she'd received over the years, each more ridiculous than the last. When it came to me, I kept it simple. You want to fix this citywide? I asked. Start by requiring third-party audits for any HOA that collects over $50,000 annually. Force them to disclose disbursements, and make it a criminal matter if they don't. The assistant city manager scribbled furiously. We've never had a case this detailed before. Most people just move away. Not everyone can move, I said. Some people lived in fear in their own homes for years because of her. You think that's just going to disappear? He looked up and, for once, didn't have a scripted response. By the time sentencing day arrived, the courtroom felt smaller. Fewer reporters. No cameras. Just a few community members and the usual court staff. Winona stood for sentencing without any family behind her. Her attorneys didn't argue for leniency. They knew better. The judge read off the sentence like a grocery list. 12 years. No parole for at least 8. Mandatory restitution. All assets acquired through fraud seized. Disbarment from any future community leadership roles. Permanent prohibition from managing financial accounts on behalf of others. When she was let out, she didn't look at me, or Curtis, or anyone. She just stared forward like she was still waiting for someone to object, to call it all a mistake, to give her one last chance to control the room. But no one did. Outside, the courthouse steps were quiet. Raina joined me at the bottom, holding a to-go cup that steamed in the crisp morning air. I still can't believe she thought no one would notice, she said. She didn't care if we did, I replied. She just thought no one would stop her. Raina nodded. Well, you did. I gave a small shrug. Only because she stepped in it literally and figuratively. She cracked a smile. We've had some colorful defendants, but I think she's the first to be taken down because of a sewer line and a bag of Quikrete. Sometimes all it takes is physics and patience. We parted ways at the crosswalk. I drove home with the radio off, windows down. The air smelled like fresh cut grass, now not chemicals or decay. I pulled into the driveway and saw a small package on my porch. Inside was a card. No signature. Just a printed note that read, "Thank you for fixing what we couldn't." Beneath it was a small, hand-carved wooden sign. It read, "Welcome to Meadow Glen Lakes, where we cleaned house." I laughed. Not a bitter laugh. Not the kind you use to mask exhaustion. Just a clean, easy laugh. Then I nailed the sign to my garage wall, right next to the framed blueprint of the sewer line I'd used to find the breach. That night, I sat on the porch with a cold drink and listened as music drifted through the neighborhood from someone's backyard speaker. Laughter followed. Not nervous, not forced. Just real. I didn't know what would come next for the community. There would be new challenges, new debates, but they'd be handled in the open, fairly, by people who actually gave a damn. And for once, that was enough. No more clipboard warnings. No more midnight fines. Just neighbors. A little scarred, a lot wiser, and finally free.